But we begin our report with the rebellion that wasn't in Russia. Or was it a rebellion? President Vladimir Putin avoided a confrontation led by the Wagner mercenary group over the weekend. But the picture of exactly what happened is still emerging. Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin temporarily seized control of a key military base in the southern part of Russia Saturday. He then headed towards Moscow, only to turn around after the leader of Belarus brokered a truce between the Russian president and the man sometimes referred to as Putin's chef. CBS News' Ian Lee reports on the revolt and the uncertain condition of Putin's power in the aftermath.
Yevgeny Prigozhin broke his silence today, releasing an audio message for the first time since agreeing to exile after his failed insurrection. The Wagner leader denied trying to overthrow Russian President Vladimir Putin and said his fight was with the country's military leaders. But hours later, the Russian president responded, calling Wagner's actions a rebellion and vowing to bring its organizers to justice. U.S. officials tell CBS News they believe Prigozhin was still in Russia as of this morning, but his current whereabouts are unknown. The revolt began Friday evening when Prigozhin blamed a Russian airstrike for killing a large number of his fighters. In retaliation, the mercenary boss marched his troops into Russia and seized the city of Rostov, home to Russia's Southern Military Command. Prigozhin then directed them toward Moscow to deal, he said, with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and his top general. Social media captured the death and destruction along the way. President Vladimir Putin began to lock down the capital as soldiers took up defensive positions. Heavy equipment ripped up the roads leading to the city. On state TV, President Putin attacked Prigozhin as a traitor. But with Wagner troops less than 150 miles from Moscow, the Kremlin seemed to have cut a deal. Wagner troops would be pardoned and returned to their bases. Criminal charges against Prigozhin would be dropped and he'd go into exile in Belarus. That agreement tonight now looks in doubt. By the end of the day Saturday, Wagner forces and Prigozhin left Rostov to a hero's goodbye, ending the mutiny. This afternoon, President Biden distanced the United States from the insurrection.
We made clear that we were not involved. We had nothing to do with it. This was part of a struggle within the Russian system.
Ukraine eagerly exploited that struggle by stepping up offensive operations, making gains in the east around the town of Bakhmut and taking another village in the south. Tonight, President Putin took aim at the West, telling his people that Russia's enemies wanted them to choke on a bloody civil strife, and he offered Wagner soldiers an option: join the Russian army or choose exile in Belarus. John?
Ian, what do we know about the Wagner Group's original intentions when they launched this march to Moscow?
Well, when they were marching to Moscow, John, a lot of people were wondering what they were going to do if they actually got to the city. And we heard from Prigozhin this evening, and he said the only thing he wanted to do was change the leadership of the Russian army. He's been very unhappy for a long time with the defense minister and the country's top general. He doesn't think they're doing a good enough job in the war in Ukraine. And so that was his main mission. He was also upset with the fact that Wagner soldiers would have to be part of the Ministry of Defense come July 1st. So this was a lot building up to this march to Moscow. But the one thing he was adamant about was that this wasn't a mutiny against Putin.
So what then are we to make? In your piece, you mentioned that Prigozhin left Rostov-on-Don to a hero's goodbye. Why were they treating him like a hero, the Russians?
The one thing that Wagner has been very successful at is fighting this war in Ukraine. They were able to take Bakhmut, although with heavy losses, but they have been seen as the force that's been able to get the job done here where the Russian military has failed. And so he has a bit of celebrity status among the Russian people. And when they arrived there, they were treated as heroes, and when they left, they were treated as heroes as well. And this has really split Russian society, despite what President Putin said this evening, that the Russian people are united. They are not united, at least from what we saw when Prigozhin was in Rostov.
So then that leads to the question, if Putin said Monday night that the organizers of the rebellion would be punished, where does that leave Prigozhin, and particularly where does that leave him if there is this split that Putin is then seemingly saying that he's not safe, that there was no deal reached?
Yeah, that's the one thing that is a bit murky this evening is what is this deal that we were told was reached over the weekend? You know, the one thing that's interesting is Putin never names Prigozhin in any of his speeches. He always talks about the organizers, the leaders of the rebellion, but never name checks him. And he says the people who led this rebellion, they will be punished according to law. Well, that means Prigozhin. But at the same time, according to this deal struck by Belarus, Prigozhin would be not criminally charged. He would go to Belarus and he would live in exile there. So there's a lot of questions right now. But, you know, the important thing here is that Putin looked weak after this mutiny. And so it does seem like he's trying to regain some of that strongman status after this weekend's events.
And what do the Ukrainians feel? I mean, do they see it as weakness by Putin? What do you hear from them?
You know, it really depends on who you speak with. You talk to the average Ukrainian, they were cheering on the Wagner forces. They wanted to see some sort of civil war inside Russia because they thought if that happens over there, then the fighting here in Ukraine would probably lessen and that they would be able to retake their country quicker. And so there was some disappointment here when Wagner did a U-turn and said that they weren't going to march on Moscow. But when you talk to and when you listen to Ukrainian defense officials, they say, you know, they don't have time for what's going on in Russia. The commander-in-chief of Ukraine said he's more worried about missiles that are striking his country. But we did see Ukraine take advantage of the chaos. They launched offensives along that front line to try to take advantage of the chaos. And so, you know, right now we're still waiting to see what effect really, if anything, this mutiny will have on the long-term effect of this war. John?
Ian Lee for us in Dnipro, Ukraine. Thank you, Ian. The rebellion has undermined the image Vladimir Putin likes to present to his people and to the world. But is there any damage other than to his image? CBS News' Remy Inocencio has more from London.
Invincibility, stability, control. The veneer Vladimir Putin has built in more than 2 decades in power. Until now, an angry Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner Mercenary Group, launching an unprecedented military challenge to Putin.
Is there blood in the water?
It's a wishful thinking of Western observers.
Sergei Markov is a former advisor to Vladimir Putin in Moscow.
I suppose that he has some kind of existential crisis because those stabilities look like doesn't exist.
Now, a mix of reaction from Moscow's streets. Everyone's confused. We need someone to explain what's going on. I knew our government would sort everything out. It's normal. We live in Russia. We're used to being stressed. The U.S. trying to stay out of the fray.
Regime change is not our policy. We've been very, very clear about that.
Yet China, mere months after Putin and President Xi Jinping met in Moscow, weighing in. China's state-run The Global Times saying Russia's situation was trending in the direction the West and Ukraine would prefer. Putin's invasion of Ukraine hasn't gone to plan from the start. Russia's losses, more than 200,000 killed or wounded.
Could this be the beginning of the end for Putin?
For sure not.
And that former advisor to Putin claims that Russian support for the president has likely even increased. His truce with Prigozhin, not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom, setting himself up for next year's presidential election. John.
Remy Inocencio, thank you.